Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
Roy Jones was one of my daddy's best friends on earth. They grew up at exactly the same time and at the same place. They spent a lot of time together as kids, an awful lot of time, and remained close friends their entire lives. If I could have Roy Jones as a guest on this podcast, you can bet I would. But I can't. But I do have the next best thing. His children had the foresight to record some of his stories about a year before he died on August the 23rd, 1996. They also transcribed it. Although I will never do this justice, I'll give it my best shot. He talks about growing up in Reynolds, Georgia, and tells some funny stories, as only he can tell. And he also talks extensively about his and my daddy's escapades. Here we go. I'm Roy Jones. I'm recording this on September 28th, 1995. The purpose is to have some record of the changes that I have seen in my lifetime in our living styles. I have really lived in two worlds, the world before World War II and the world after. I often think how interesting it would have been if some of the family members had left some type of autobiography to show how they lived. The family tree is good, but it is pretty dull. The real stories are in the life they lived. As a preface, I was born at the right time in history and in the right place. I have seen so many changes and inventions, many of them coming after the age of 21. I am now 79. I married the best wife in the world, and I don't think I could have married a better woman who could have suited me as Ruth has. I have wonderful children, every one. I think if I had to pick when and where I was born, I would pick the same. I had the best neighbors, best friends, the best co-workers, even casual acquaintances through my work. All of this adds up to what I think is a very happy life. I was blessed to live in the period I lived in and witness the many changes in a community like Reynolds, Georgia, and Taylor County. My daddy's folks always lived in Reynolds, and my mama's people lived near Butler, so this has been my home. There were wonderful stories told. These stories were told thousands of times because it was before we had radio and TV. First, a description of Reynolds. This is during my early childhood during the 1920s. Most of the buildings were two-story brick buildings built all close together without a firewall or anything between them. This proved to be a bad thing later on. On the west side of the block of buildings was a tin shelter that extended all over the sidewalk. It must have been 100 to 150 feet long. That's for people to get under when the weather got bad. Saturday was a big day. All the black people came to town on that day from the farms, and they just crowded the sidewalks. An unusual thing across the south side was a park that I believe was donated by Mr. Coleman, one of the first settlers of the area, that comprised of must be 4 acres of land. He gave it to be used as a park and for the establishment of churches. On the south side of the park was a Baptist church. At that time, it was a nice white wooden church. On the northeast corner of the park was the Methodist church. It was and is an impressive building that was built right after World War II. In the center was a bandstand. On Sunday afternoon, the local performers would get up and give a concert. It was torn down, much to my chagrin, because I thought it made a perfect setting for a park. All streets and sidewalks were dirt. All of the stores, or most of them, were in the bottom of the two-story buildings. Upstairs housed the dentist and lawyer's offices. Right in the middle of the block was a hotel called the Big Oak Hotel. There used to be a big oak that stood by the sidewalk right in front of it. and it had a balcony extended over the sidewalk. I was always sorry that I didn't ever go up there and watch the people, but I never did. The telephone office was also located on the second floor of a building about center on the west side of the business block. The funny thing was that we always had a telephone extended out in the country. There were always jokes about the party lines. I think we paid $2 a month, and we had 5 parties on our line. When you rang the operator, we called her Central. You could tell who you wanted, not the number. We did have a phone book, but nobody went to the trouble of looking up the number. A lot of times she could look out the window and see the person you were calling on the sidewalk. She would call them and get them into the drugstore to talk to you. At one time, we had 3 or 4 doctors. Most of them were located in the back of the drugstore, which made it convenient. Most things were bought on credit. The farmers depended on cotton and sold it once a year. They had no income except that one day when they would sell their cotton. One story that shows the extent of credit that may be true and may not be true involves the Barra brothers. They operated a hardware store. There were not such things as fresh vegetables to sell, but each store would sell cheese, crackers, flour points, and small tools. The Barra brothers operated in a 2-story building on the southwest corner of the business block. One of them one day told the other that he had sold a saddle, but could not remember who he had sold it to and couldn't find a record of having charged it. They thought of it a long time and decided to put one saddle on the top of each of the statements. When the farmers came in to pay their statement in the fall, the one who didn't object would be the one who had bought the saddle. In the fall, when the farmers paid up, nobody objected. Every one of them paid the cost of the saddle. Across the street from the Barras was also a 2-story building that sold everything. It sold clothes in addition to groceries. In the back of Goddard's store was his undertaking establishment. Later on, you could buy your baby food in the front and have your funeral in the back. They eventually moved out and built a nice funeral home. One of the first businesses was the Ford dealer, Mr. Crawford. He couldn't read or write, but he was still a good businessman. The story is that Clyde Hill, the druggist, went to try a new car. Mr. Hill was a type of desperado when it came to driving. They went across the railroad tracks, and Mr. Hill started going too fast. Mr. Crawford reached down to the floorboard and got the instructions. He said, "This instruction book says here you have to stay between the ditches." The gins were dependent on cotton. At that time, we had 2 gins that were located not over 2 blocks from the business section. We had an ice house located in one of the gins. The only time we could get ice was on Friday when they would bring it from Macon. The jail stood right across the railroad that bisects the town going east and west. The jail couldn't have been over 12 or 15 feet square and stood out in the hot sun, 75 or 80 feet from any building or shade tree. I think it had one window at the top, and it had a heavy door with a chain through it. It would be an awful place to be, hot or cold weather. I mentioned we had 3 or 4 doctors. Medicine back then was pretty primitive. This is a story told about Tom Sanders. Mr. Sanders was 28 years old and became constipated. He had never been to a doctor. He went to Dr. Mangum and told him the problem. Back then, all they knew to do was to give an enema. Dr. Mangum told him to lie on the table on his stomach. As the doctor began his procedure, Tom Sanders jumped up and yelled, "Be careful there, Doc. You almost stuck something up my ass." You develop a town like Reynolds in strange patterns. About a block from the main section was a big storm pit. I guess it was contagious, but a lot of people would head to the storm pit when a cloud came up or looked any way threatening. One Sunday afternoon, we went for a ride, and there had been a shower about 30 minutes before. We came by the storm pit. They were marching out, and all were looking around to see where it was. It had been gone for 30 minutes or more. The stores sold most of the same thing, except we had 2 or 3 meat markets. They didn't have deliveries like they do now. The manager of the meat market would find cows and butcher them and bring them and sell them during the weekend. It was anything but sanitary or humane. We had a few cows, mostly dairy cows. Daddy sold one grown cow, and the meat market manager came out to kill the cow. Daddy was gone. The man came to the door to see if we had a shotgun because they were having trouble killing the cow. That's about as bad as you can get. But we only had meat on the weekend. There was no such thing as fresh vegetables, so the big seller was cheese. Across the railroad track was the black section. We called it the bottom. Most of the houses were similar, that they had 2 or 3 rooms. Everything was built out of wood. There were 3 brick homes in Reynolds. One owned by Dr. Bryan, the other was owned by Charlie Neisler, who owned the gin and the warehouse where they stored the cotton. The third one was built out of some kind of stone by Mr. Ricks, who also operated a gin and a warehouse. Most of them that operated a gin and warehouse were considered the top men in a town like Reynolds. The other houses were built out of wood. Most were painted and looked attractive. Of course, at that time, we didn't have modern grass for lawns. There wasn't any way to cut it, so we swept the yards once a week on a Friday afternoon. There's really nothing prettier than to see a yard as clean as it can be and showing the print of the broom. The broom came from sassafras bushes that had a lot of branches at the top and made a perfect broom. Some of them used cane brooms, but that was slow and a tedious process. A lot of people within a block of the business section had milk cows. I particularly remember Mr. Flowers that taught school. He lived in what is now the Crawley house. On Halloween, he had gone off and somebody got his milk cow. He hunted for him the whole weekend but couldn't find him. On Monday, when they opened the school, they found the milk cow upstairs in Mr. Flowers' classroom. Mr. Flowers was old and they liked to play jokes on him. How they got the cow upstairs and how they got the cow down, I don't know. Before we had radio and TV, people were closer together and had more conversations, and lots of stories were told. One of these stories involves Judge Altman and Mr. Parris. Down Railroad Street, right at the east side of the business block, facing the railroad, was the Parris house. It was across from Rick's Gin, where they're building a tourist place now. It was a hotel built in a long L shape and had a porch, and the boards went up and down like you see chicken houses built sometimes. It was protected from the weather because the porch went all the way around. Every room opened on the porch, and I guess there were chairs by every room, but that's where most of the traveling salesmen would stay. They would have a standing reservation. They would work the stores and then go there and sleep. One of them was Jewish and would fuss about everything. Nothing suited him. Judge Altman was Bobby Altman's grandfather and a justice of the peace. When I started school, I know he was the mayor. At the start of school, Mr. Joyner got everybody in the auditorium, and Judge Altman welcomed us to Reynolds. Most of the students came from the country. I thought Judge Altman would always be the mayor, and I guess he might have been. The only thing I remember people saying about him, and I don't know if it was a criticism or a compliment, was that if there was a sideshow in the United States, he was going to get it for Reynolds. Back then, we didn't have much entertainment, and we had all kinds of shows. Sometimes it wouldn't be anything but a man and his monkey. Anyway, Judge Altman and Mr. Parris were the best of friends. I don't know which one thought it up, but they decided to pull a prank on the salesman. They decided since he's always fussing and nothing suits him, they would give him something to fuss about. There weren't any bathroom waterworks back then, so each room had a slop jar. I think they've been used since the beginning of time. They filled a jar with home brew, and I think they put some crackers in it too, and put it on the bed in the man's room. They knew it was the day he was coming, and they sat on the porch and waited for his arrival. Sure enough, he went to his room, and he came storming out. He was upset and said this place is not fit for a pig to live in. They asked what was the matter. He replied that for one thing, the slop jar hasn't been emptied for days. They jumped up, and Judge Altman said, "Parris, let's show him just how nice and clean a place you run." They went to the room, and he followed them. Mr. Parris reached under the bed and got the slop jar and started drinking it. The man started jumping up and down and said, "Stop it, gentlemen, stop it." But they passed it to each other. They said it was mighty good, and they paused. The man said had he known they were going to drink it, he wouldn't have used it when he came in the room. Maybe Jamie Barra did not want but one customer in his store at a time, or more likely he wanted his store neighbor and competitor to think he was really busy. Mr. Charlie B. Hicks' store was next to the Barra store. Both were hardware stores. Mr. Barra had a rope going down the length of the store that was attached to a bell. When you got done and there wasn't anybody in there but him, he would pull the rope and ring the bell and say that you were to get out and let the next person in. A well-known local lady was in the store and telling some kind of story. Mr. Barra had heard all he could handle. He called a young boy over to him who happened to be in the store and said, "You stand here and listen to her story. I've got work to do." Rick's store got ice in on Thursday or Friday each week, and you would buy some for the whole weekend. This was block ice, by the way. You would get it on Saturday or Sunday morning and wrap it up in towels. 50 pounds might last until Monday. 100 pounds would last until Tuesday. One year on the hottest day of the summer, Mr. Barra bought all of the ice from Rick's one Saturday. He built an ice house in his yard and sat in it all day long. He had bought all the ice and no one had any for tea. He also sat in it all day on Sunday. I told you a little bit about the town itself. The town couldn't survive if it wasn't for the farmers. The land around Reynolds is above average. Some is as good as any in the country. The Crowell community north of Reynolds, about 7 or 8 miles, is where the old Indian reservation was the last to leave. That land line runs northeast to southeast. I don't know how they came about it, but most of the farmers had about 100 acres of land. Economically, they were about the same. It made for a good community. Each one tried to outdo the other. The land was so good that it could support the families. One of the oldest churches is the Crowell Methodist Church. The average farm would run about 200 acres. A farm without woods was not considered desirable because we used woods for everything. If you didn't have woods on your farm, it was considered to be a bad thing. Most were worked by 2 mules. That's all we had to plow with. Each mule could work about 30 to 40 acres, which meant you had 80 acres a man. Cotton was the only thing you could sell in those days. A few families were big enough to work the land themselves. The others were done by sharecroppers. Each farm would have about 2 tenant houses. You wouldn't call them shacks. With a lot of them, you were not much worse off than the farm owners. We didn't have anything to preserve the wood with. Our house was always screened, but the screen was so coarse it would let the mosquitoes through. The tenant house usually had wood shutters. When those shutters were closed, you lived in darkness. We didn't have electricity back then. We had lamps, rail lamps. It had shiny brass that would reflect the light better. A lot used glass lamps. Most of the water came from open wells. Since the mules used more water than the people, the wells were generally located as close to the mule lot so that you could just pour water over the fence to the mules. I'm sure today it would not pass any type of qualifications. There's an art to drawing well water. Most had a pulley with a rope or chain that went through the pulley. There would be a tin bucket on each end. You let the bucket down and fill it with water. As you pulled it up, the empty bucket would be going down. When that bucket would hit the water, it would lie on its side. You had to have the right twitch, or else the bucket would jump up and down. Most of the people that used the wells knew exactly how to pull and to let the top of the bucket go under the water just a little bit. Then the bucket would go on in and sink. There were a few exceptions to the small farm. One was the large plantation that had 18 or 20 mules and 6 or 8 tenant houses. They would always get sharecroppers because back then people liked to live close together. The sharecropper would furnish the labor for planting the crops. The owner would buy the fertilizer and seed. The sharecropper would pay the owner back with half of his crops. It came in bad repute, but it worked pretty good because it gave a man the incentive to work when all he had to give was labor. If there wasn't any trouble by the fall, they would want to sharecrop with you the next year. I guess some owners would want to cheat them out, but most times they were making money for the owner because things were so cheap, particularly in the Depression. Most played fair and square. Of course, if the sharecropper didn't like it, he would move off and get another place. Some liked to move, but most stayed in the same place for years. My daddy had the best reputation as anybody in the world. I never ever heard him say as much as doggone. He was a mail carrier and started carrying the mail in about 1900. He carried it in a buggy, then a motorcycle, then a car. When he died, I think he was using a 1931 or 1932 model Chevrolet. It's nothing compared to what we have today. Back then, the mailman just went down the main road, and the people lived off from it would put up boxes. In a lot of places, they would have them mounted on wagon wheels. The mailman would turn the wheels to get to the 6 or 8 boxes. A lot of advertising was done by giving out samples in those days. We didn't have the media like radio or TV or even newspaper. Samples from companies were just put in all the mailboxes. One time, I remember, I believe it was Phenamint or X-Lax causing trouble. The samples had been put in all the boxes. Children would get the mail and some thought they were candy or chewing gum. It was a real problem, especially when there were multiple boxes. But that's the way they advertised. Hoke McDaniel was one of the real characters in Reynolds. He made the Depression a little easier to live through. He lived about a mile from Reynolds in a painted house on good land. He was an automobile mechanic by trade. He looked that part. He died in the Reynolds Hospital. The day before he died, Dr. Sams was making the rounds. Hoke asked him if he had brought the asbestos soup. I'm going to need it for where I'm going. He had a bunch of children, but I never heard of any trouble from any of them. This is a classic story, and it sounds like him. He sat around in the drugstore where the men would visit. It was during a gubernatorial election, and Mr. Charlie Neisler, who owned the bank and automobile place, was the most influential man in the county. He had served as a state representative before then. Governor Tubby Hardman came in town, and Mr. Neisler was escorting him around Reynolds and stopped at the drugstore. Hoke jumped up and met him. He was excited and told the governor that it had been a long time. He thought they wouldn't ever run into each other again. The governor was a good politician and didn't act surprised, even though he had never seen Hoke before in his life. He went along and said it had been a real long time. Hoke asked him, "What have you been doing since we were together?" The governor replied that he'd been a doctor for 30 to 40 years. He asked Hoke, "What about you?" Hoke replied that he had straightened up too, came on home. Hoke then asked the governor, "Wasn't that Birmingham jail one of the deadest places you've ever been in?" Mr. Neisler was furious and blessed out Hoke, but that wasn't going to stop him. Right across the street from the drugstore was the Reynolds Banking Company. The bank was one of the easiest businesses to get closed up during the Depression. You could go in the morning and the door could be locked. A note would say, "This bank is closed under regulations of so-and-so." Everyone would read the note on the door and check the handle to the door. Mr. Luke Mitchell lived a mile out of Reynolds in a 2-story house. He had a terrible affliction. His legs would go before his chest and head. He tried to hide it. He could walk without a walking stick, but he would carry one in each hand. He walked up to the bank to read the sign. The people from the drugstore would watch everyone read the notes. A salesman was in the drugstore at that time. Hope told the salesman that the man reading the note was Mr. Mitchell and was one of the biggest depositors in the bank. "He's soiling his pants right now." The salesman watched Mr. Mitchell and said, "Doggone if he didn't. I can't wait until I can tell what I saw in Reynolds." Hoke would pick up hitchhikers and say, "Let's get a bite to eat." They would eat, and Mr. Hoke would tell them that he was in a bit of a hurry, but he would pay as he left so that they could stay as long as they needed. The hitchhikers would tell the cashier that his dinner had been paid for. She would say that, "No, Hoke said that you were going to pay for it." There are hundreds of stories about Mr. Hoke, and sometimes a joke was pulled on him. Once he was underneath a car he was working on. A salesman came in and asked for Mr. Hoke. A man said that he's there under the car, but you better talk as loud as you can so he can hear you. The salesman thought Mr. Hoke was hard of hearing. He screamed at him as he rolled out from under the car. Mr. Hoke talked loudly right back. The conversation continued until one of them finally figured that neither one of them was deaf. Mr. Hoke went to extremes having fun with other people. Once he mounted lights on the back of his car. His plan was that when he passed a car, we only had dirt roads back then, he would turn on the lights on the back of the car and the people would think they were meeting a car. He tried it out on Blackman Curve, a curvy road that used to be 6 miles below Reynolds. The people back of him took off through the woods and had a wreck. He didn't try that trick anymore. Harry Powell ran the meat market, cafe, hamburger stand. He would stand next to the window on the left where he cooked the hamburgers, and to the right was the meat market. In the back were the tables where he served meals. You didn't order, you would serve what he had. It was one meal for everybody, and he called it a sawmill dinner. They were good, except you were served twice of what you could eat. Mr. Hoke called it a full house. They were all eating dinner when Mr. Hoke opened the screen door in the front and held up a dead dog. He said loudly, "Harry, this one is bigger than yesterday. What would you give me for him?" Hash was being served for dinner, and it was said most everybody put their silverware down and marched out. Mr. Hoke lived near the veterinarian, Mr. Clifford Watley. Why Mr. Clifford would haul Mr. Hoke around with him, I don't know, but Mr. Hoke went with him a heap of times. I called the vet one night for a sick mule. That's the worst feeling in the world. It was always costly to replace a mule when there wasn't any money, but especially hard in the middle of crop season. Mr. Hoke knew I was worried to death about my mule and called me over. I asked him if he thought my mule was going to live and be all right. He said, "Let me put it this way. Every tool that Dr. Watley uses is made by Winchester." He wasn't very soothing. Just as a reminder, I'm reading the words and stories of Roy Jones, recorded and transcribed in 1995, about a year before he passed away. The sincerest compliment that I can give Ed Goddard is that he had a wholesome effect on my life for 70 years. Our families have long been friends. Our daddies were fishing buddies together. I remember my papa saying that Mr. E.A. Goddard, Ed's grandfather, liked to kid him, but he always ended with, "I never kidded a man that I didn't like." There were lots of qualities that shone in Ed, but his ingenuity was shown at an early age, like the first time he spent the night with me. We were 8 or 10 years old. He slept at our house. The next day, when it was time for him to go, he begged and begged me to spend the night with him, which I did. Later that night, he told me that he was glad I spent the night with him because his daddy was really mad. He said Ed had imposed on my mama by spending the night with me. Now that I had spent the night with him and it imposed on his mama, everything was all right. We lived to fish and spent many a night in the swamp. One time when we were around 16, we decided to sleep in the swamp. I had an old boat near Double Bridges where the creek gets big. We got there that morning, and because the creek had risen, the body was muddy. We couldn't even catch any small fish for bait. We tried everything. I remember that Matthew Carson, a sharecropper on the place, had killed a rattlesnake the day before. We found that snake, skinned it, and used it for bait. A tree had fallen in the water, so we tied the hooks to the limbs on both sides of the tree. There were so many fish striking that it looked like the tree was moving. We spent the whole night paddling around the treetops, setting hooks, and had a string full of catfish. Rattlesnake was the best bait we ever used. On another trip, we spent the night near Grandma Jones's sucker hole. The mosquitoes normally were not too bad, but that night they were about to carry us off. We saw we weren't going to get any sleep, so we devised a plan. At the count of 3, we jumped up and ran 500 yards through the swamp to Hickory Top. We doubled back about 30 to 40 feet. We ran over everything in our way, but we figured we could leave the mosquitoes behind us. Everything was quiet. Then we heard the mosquitoes fly right by us. We thought we were safe until we realized mosquitoes were doubling back just like we had. We still stayed the night, but I don't think we got much sleep. The carp story in the swamp is one of my favorites. Miss Lucy, John, Lydia, Ed, and I were fishing at Clear Lake. We could drive to 28 Break, which is way in the swamp. We walked about a mile from there to Clear Lake. We weren't catching much, and I told Ed that I had found another lake while duck hunting that I didn't know existed. He and I went there with our reels. We got there and the lake had almost dried up. It was awful looking. Everything had died for lack of oxygen, except for 3 carp. They would swim and come up for air, then go back under. Ed said we ought to catch them. We tried our reels, but the hooks wouldn't penetrate the fish. They were so tough. We decided to try a different approach. We found some dead pine limbs to use as clubs. When the carp would come up for air, we would club them. The 3 carp we got were tremendous in size. They looked really good when we cleaned them up in a levee pit. We took them back to Clear Lake, and as soon as Miss Lucy saw them, she said that we didn't catch them. We had been mudding, and those fish weren't fit to eat. Ed said he could sell them for 50 cents apiece. She thought, you'll kill somebody too. We carried them back to the car, which was itself a big undertaking. Miss Lucy, who was Ed's mother, by the way, made her final appeal to leave the fish, but we put them in the trunk. We sold them at Jake Prager's store. 2 or 3 days later in the afternoon, the phone rang. It was Ed. He said, I know you're on a party line. Do you think anybody's listening? I just found out that Jake Prager is sick. I said, Ed, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, I think that's the right way to go. I don't even remember calling you. Goodbye. Both of us were very relieved when Jake Prager opened his store a week later. Another night on April the 1st, when we were around 23, Ed and I walked to the river in the swamp where now there's this school bus body. It was warm and pleasant. We set out our hooks and then it began to turn cold. We built a fire and tried to go to sleep, but we couldn't due to the cold. Our feet could be warm when next to the fire, but our faces would freeze. We finally got the idea of building another fire so that our faces and feet would both be warm. On April 1st, I always see in the paper that April 1st, 1940 was a record low, the night we nearly froze to death. Once we went to Cat Lake, we were planning to use the boat that was left there. We found the boat locked by some big muscadine vines. The vines were about 3 inches in diameter and very tough. Ed said we could cut the vine with a pocket knife, which he tried to do. He cut and pulled and struggled. I looked up and saliva had covered his chin. He looked like a mad dog, he had worked so hard. But he did get the boat out. He had determination. On another fishing trip, we had put our hooks around Bryan Bridges. The river was coming through the creek. We stayed too long, and we got back. The stream was 10 or 12 feet wide. Since we were going to spend the night in the swamp, we couldn't wade it because we didn't want to get our clothes wet. Ed looked up, and there was a big muscadine vine that went into the sky and was attached to a big oak limb. Ed figured we could swing across, which we did. We felt like Tarzan. I named that place Goddard's Crossing. Ed always smiled when I mentioned Goddard's Crossing. Ed was so proud of a pistol he received in his early 20s that he inherited from his grandfather, McCoy. He would send me to Jamie Barra's to buy the bullets. It was a fine pistol, engraved on it, Police Special, a .38 caliber. He would carry the pistol everywhere he went in the swamp. He would walk up to a tree, yell, hands up, and point the pistol at the tree. The next story is one that I felt awful about. We were fishing down below Bryan Bridges. The fish weren't striking. I came along the creek, and he was standing on the bank. I made like I was going to push him, but I didn't touch him. Ed dodged and lost his balance and fell into the creek. Ed was big and strong, but clumsy. He was going to scare me by reaching for the pistol, but it was gone. We spent the day diving in looking for it, but we were at the deep point of the creek. We finally gave up. Ed said that this was the worst thing that has ever happened to us. He had to leave for Emory, so we went home. I told Matthew Carson what had happened. Matthew, a sharecropper on the farm, was a person who could do anything. He said we would go look for it the next day. When I met him there the following day, he was dragging a piece of 1/4-inch pipe with a pitchfork attached with the tines bent like a rake. He stuck it into the water, and about the second pull he made contact. I dove in and got it. I then went to the depot and sent a telegram to Ed. It said, "Found pistol." Mrs. Hodges asked if that's all I wanted to put in the telegram. I replied, that was enough. Ruth and I got married in 1946, with Ed being my best man. After we returned from our honeymoon, Ed told me that he made a little error. Reverend John Lowell, the Methodist minister from Montezuma, had married us. Ed said the minister told him goodbye 3 times. It wasn't until he was home that he reached into his pocket and found the money that I had given him to pay the preacher. He said, and I'm hoping that it's true, that he jumped into his car and took it to the minister. In addition to our social activities, I also had business dealings with Ed. Once I bought a water pump, my first jet pump from Ed, and I think it was the first one he ever sold, too. The pump was too small and he couldn't get it to work. He undertook to dig a hole in the ground so the pump wouldn't be pulling water so many feet. We would dig and dig, but the pump couldn't pull the water. He would dig some more. We finally had dug such a deep pit, the pump finally worked. We decided to concrete the hole and use it as a flower pot. Ed sold everything. When TVs first became popular, I bought one from Ed. He had a lot of ability and could always fix it. It was always amazing to me that he could repair a TV as clumsy as he was. I did all kinds of business with Ed. He was an ingenious salesman. Once in the 1930s, he called me and said, "I want to sell you a good milk cow and a calf for $75. I guess he had gotten them as a funeral payment. I told him that I would like to, but I didn't have $75. He asked that if I had $75, would I buy the cow and the calf? I said, yes, if I had the $75, I would. He said goodbye. About an hour later, he drove in the backyard with a note from the Reynolds Bank. He said, "Mr. Bell said that your credit is worth $75. Hanson is at the corner bringing the cow and the calf." I saw Hanson, and he had only a cow. I asked Ed, where was the calf? He said that it's in the cow. I said, that's not a cow and a half. That's a cow with a calf. He replied, you aren't going to let one little word interfere with the sale, are you? We kept the cow. One event that turned into a memorial experience was a trip to Atlanta. Just before my wedding, Ed decided he needed a new pair of shoes. He talked me into taking him to Atlanta to get a pair. He added that we would eat at his brother George and Carol's house. I agreed to this. As we headed out of town, he said that Hugh Neisler wanted us to stop by the bank in Reynolds. Ed came out of the bank with a pasteboard box. He threw it on the floor and said that there was $30,000 in cash in it. We were to deposit it at First National Bank of Atlanta. We had enough sense to complete that task first. We then set out to find Ed some shoes. I had never been in such a shoe store like the one Ed took me to. It seemed like a block long with nothing but shoes. The clerk measured his foot and shook his head. He said they didn't carry this large of a shoe. Ed asked that with all of these shoes, they didn't have one that would fit him. The salesman replied that if they did, he didn't know about it. But he added that occasionally a customer orders a special size and then refuses to buy a shoe. He said they throw those shoes on top of the shelves. Ed asked that I take one aisle and he would take another aisle and look for 15 EE. We didn't have any luck. I'm not sure how many stores that we tried, but we sure tried plenty. We went into one store where the clerk was sitting with his feet against the counter. He looked at Ed's feet and shook his head. He never said a word. We gave up on shoes. Ed said that he needed to go by W.D. Alexander's, the distributor for GE products in Georgia. He directed me how to go. On the front of the building was a big sign that said no parking. There was a space marked with concrete on the front that would hold 3 cars. Ed said to park there. I asked what I was going to do about the no parking sign. He said to tell anybody that asked that I was with a GE dealer. It wasn't a minute after Ed left when a policeman appeared. The officer said that it was a no parking zone, and I responded I was with a GE dealer. The policeman asked if the sign said anything about GE dealers. He said to move the car. I didn't know where I was in Atlanta, so I started circling the block, driving as slow as I could to give Ed time. I was afraid if I took in more territory, I would get lost and never find the place again. After circling the block dozens of times, I thought I could stop and run in and tell Ed the predicament and to get him to come on. Just at that time, the same policeman pulled up beside me. He said, "I thought I told you not to park here." I explained my plan. He stated I didn't have time for anything, and that if he found my car parked here one more time, a wrecker would be called to take me and the car to headquarters. I did some more circling. Finally, Ed came out, and we started for George and Carol's house. I guess we were on Peachtree Street when I stopped for a traffic light. The car choked down and wouldn't start. The battery was dead. Ed said that there must be a filling station down the street and that he would go get help. I waved cars around me when the light turned green. One man pulled behind me and asked what the trouble was. I explained, and he said that he would give me a shove. I was wondering if he was going to push me through a red light, but he waited for it to turn green. Now I was in the same shape as I was at W.D. Alexander's. I took in 2 blocks and circled, except that I went fast to charge the battery that had run down from the previous circling. After 15 to 20 minutes, I looked up at the mirror and saw a hand out each side of a wrecker waving. I stopped and it pulled up beside me. Ed and this fella had been following me for a long time. I followed him to a filling station and we bought a new battery for $15. We thought everything was all right. We went to George and Carol's and ate supper and headed home about 10 o'clock. We got out of the city lights of Atlanta, not quite to Hapeville, and I told Ed that I didn't think that we had any lights. We looked, and each bulb had one little red wire for each side. I asked him what we were going to do. He said to head home. The moon was shining brighter than I ever saw it before. We came through Hapeville, Griffin, and Barnesville. At every traffic light, I pulled the car in neutral and stepped on the foot feed to keep the motor running. We hardly met anybody on the road, and when we did, we pulled off the road. We got home without any more trouble. Every Thursday afternoon in the summer, all of the Goddards, John and Lydia, and often a guest or two, would go to the creek bream fishing. The Goddards would bring the frying pans, and we would stay there to cook and eat the fish. One Thursday night, we had finished supper, and it was getting dark. I saw Miss Lucy, who was hard of hearing, get the lantern and go into the woods. She circled back close to our camp and lit the lantern down and squatted. I was hoping no one would see her, but Mr. George did. He jumped up and shouted, "Lucy, you can't do that there. You have to get further away." Around 1938 to 1939, Ed and I talked about going to the Okefenokee Swamp. There had been a lot written about the swamp in the papers. The government didn't control it then, and no one claimed to own it. The papers always mentioned Lem Griffiths, who lived closest to the swamp. We decided to go, so I wrote a special delivery letter to Mr. Griffiths and told him we were coming on a date 3 weeks away. I included a self-addressed stamped envelope with the letter and said that if it wasn't a good time, we could come any time. We didn't hear from him by the time we were to go, so we decided to go as planned anyway. We were going to leave on a Sunday, fish one day, and then leave. However, we had a problem with the cars. Ed had a 29 or 30 Chevy. Ours was a 32. His tires weren't any good, and mine weren't much better. He took the cars to Guy Wyndham's filling station for his advice. He said that we had a total of 8 spares and 2 tires on the cars. We took the 2 best tires off my car and put them on Ed's rear. It made his car sit high in the back because mine were larger than his. In my letter to Mr. Griffiths, I said we would be there late Sunday afternoon. We kept moving the time up for us to leave, and we finally started on early Sunday morning. We went through Douglas and saw a sign for foot-long hot dogs, 20 cents. That's the only time I ever ate a foot-long hot dog. We went south from Douglas. Ed's gas gauge was broken, and we ran out of gas. There was a fellow behind us. We asked how far it was to Homerville. He said, "You're in the city limits now." He was the nicest kind of fellow and said he had some gas at home. He and Ed went off together and came back with a 5-gallon can of gas. He refused to take any money and made us put it all in the car. That suited us fine, and we went on to Fargo. A fellow told us in order to get to Lem Griffith's house to take the road he pointed out and go to the end. It was 8 or 9 miles. The county never worked the road, but we made it. We came to a corner, and there was a house with a man on a swing. We told him we were hunting for Lem Griffiths. He said, "You have found him. Get out and set a spell." We sat on his porch, and I said, "I know you're not expecting us this early, but we came on." He said, "I don't know why I would be expecting you at all." I told him about the letter that we wrote 3 weeks earlier. He said, "I've got to go get my mail. I haven't gotten it this month." We asked if he could arrange to take us into the swamp, and he asked how far we wanted to go. Ed said, "As far as you can go in there." He said he wasn't to stand the trip, but Lonnie would take us. He offered to put us up for the night and took us to a building that looked like it was once a chicken house. It was divided into 3 sections, with each section having 2 bunk beds made of rough lumber. He said, "You're going to need to get some grits in your craw tomorrow morning. I'll fix you some." There was only one car that came out of the swamp that night, and it had a cottonmouth moccasin the length of the car tied to it. I don't think we slept much that night. Mr. Griffiths woke us up at 3 a.m., said the grits were ready. That's all we had. We don't know where Lonnie came from or what his last name was, but he was waiting for us out front. He had a beat-up Johnson motor. We had a jug of water, and Lonnie had a vinegar jug half full of clear liquid. It was about a half-mile ride west of the swamp. There were 2 boats anchored, and Lonnie put the motor on one of them. He had all the equipment, and he asked us, "Don't you want a swig of moonshine?" We didn't take any, but that didn't stop him. Ed sat in the bow, and I sat in the middle of the boat. We took off on Billy's Lake. The only way Lonnie knew how to run the motor was wide open. I don't know how he could see. He would hit underwater obstructions and sometimes break a prop pin. Before he would replace it, he would take another drink of whiskey. In some places, the logs in the water would be where you could see them. He would yell, "Hold on," and jump them all except a couple. We pulled the boat over those. We finally came to another lake that was much like Billy's Lake. Ed was sitting at the front end of the boat. The spiders had built webs from tree to tree. He would have to break the webs with his hands. He wanted to change seats. It wasn't long before we came to the prairies. There was a tree in sight. We followed the stream, and then we ran into the big water, our destination. It must have been after 11 o'clock, and that's when we started fishing. About every 3rd cast, we'd get a strike. The majority were jackfish, but we caught many bass too. Near the center of the lake was a tree house, a platform with a tin roof over it. We ate lunch there. Lonnie borrowed one of our reels and was going to show us how to make a long cast. Somehow he got the hook stuck in his thigh. He pulled out his pocket knife and said, "Hate to cut these new overalls." With his knife, he cut the overalls, dug into his thigh, got the hook out, and poured whiskey into the wound. We were ready to really catch some fish, but Lonnie said it was time to head home. We came out of the swamp, cleaned the fish, and stopped in Homerville for a tub to pack them in. My idea was to go stay with my daddy's sister and her husband in Jacksonville. My daddy's brother was also there, who I knew would welcome us. We headed for Lake City on the way to Jacksonville. Back in those days, a lot of homes took in tourists. One particular home had a little boy standing in front with a sign on him saying "Rooms," and he was pointing to a 2-story house. Ed decided to stop. He asked the lady on the porch if she would take fish for rooms. She wanted the bass, but not the jack. Ed finally told her that all of the bass had been spoken for. They agreed to take 3 jack for giving us room. We were waking early the next morning. The kitchen was right below us. There was a violent argument, and every now and then you could hear the words "Gene Talmadge." One apparently was for him, one against. I think the time was a few days before the Democratic primary. We stopped at a cafe for breakfast and headed for Jacksonville. On the edge of Jacksonville, we decided to freshen up before going to Aunt Lizzie's house. Ed came out of the restroom and said, "We have to go back and get my coat." I asked him where it was, and he replied, "In that cafe in Lake City." I tried to talk him out of it, but he just had to go get it. We went back 70 miles and found the coat. On our first trip to Jacksonville, there had been a cow dead in the road, which wasn't unusual because it was open range country. When we made the return trip, all that was left was a bunch of bones. The vultures had eaten the cow. Aunt Lizzie welcomed us with open arms. Uncle Rob and Aunt Lucy had a daughter about our age who also had a guest from Hapeville. Frances, my cousin, latched on to Ed and gave me a date with her friend Lorena. We went out, and I don't know whether it was us or them, but we ended up at the Roosevelt Hotel nightclub. The next night, we went out to the George Washington Hotel nightclub. The Roosevelt and Washington were bound to be the most two expensive places in Jacksonville. We came to our senses and cut down on our spending. We had been there 3 or 4 days with no plans to leave. Early one morning, a boy dressed in a Western Union outfit knocked on the door with a telegram for Ed. It said, "Come home at once." We were ready to go in 30 minutes. At the city limits of Jacksonville, I said, "Ed, you got to put gas in the car. I'm broke." He handed me his billfold with the thinnest 2 pieces of leather that I'd ever saw. Not even a dollar bill. We counted our change. Between us, we had $1.35. We stopped near the state line, and when I came out of the restroom, there was a crowd watching someone playing the one-armed bandit. It was Ed. I told him that we have to get home, and he said he was trying to make enough money for us to get there. I got him stopped, and we headed up Highway 41. We got near Araba, and there was a big sign, 5 gallons for gas for 77 cents. We raised the 77 cents and came home. This gas was the cheapest we had seen. There were a lot of things Ed told me. One in particular stands out. We were quail hunting, and I told him I was getting cold. He said to imagine that I was warm. That's what counted. He then told me about a time when he was in high school and was spending the night with John and Lydia in the country. The wind began to blow and it was turning cold. He brought in the wood for the fireplace. The wind was howling, and they began to watch the thermometer. It was dropping 10 degrees, it seemed, every time they checked it. They brought the animals in the house. When it got near zero, they decided to sit up all night to keep the fire going. Lydia was concerned about her mom and daddy, so she gave them a call to see how they were handling the cold weather. Her mama said that it wasn't even freezing in town. They then checked their thermometer and noticed that it had a crack. It had been cracked when the wood was brought in and the mercury was leaking. When they found that out, the room warmed up. They put the animals out and went to bed. Again, those were the words of Roy Jones. My final thought. I saved this story for the last, for a reason. There's a lesson for us that is coming from the graves of a couple of best friends who thoroughly enjoyed the time they had together on planet Earth, when they had it and where they had it. They both lived life on their terms, and they both had a wonderful life. If you think you're cold, imagine you're warm. If you think you feel bad, imagine you're well. If you think you feel sad, imagine you're happy. If you think you feel afraid, imagine you're confident. If you think you feel angry, imagine you're peaceful. If you think you feel hate, imagine you feel love. Napoleon Hill said it another way. Whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve. Maybe we all need to change our minds.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.